As a podcast, talk about it, think about it, discuss it. That's a podcast.
Ever feel like your brain is stuck back in the Stone Age while the rest of the world is like zooming ahead at warp speed?
I know that feeling.
Well, that's kind of the whole idea behind this book we're diving into today, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century,
Right.
by Heying and Bret Weinstein. And they suggest that our modern world is changing so fast, our poor hunter-gatherer brains are struggling to keep up.
Yeah, it's like almost like trying to run the latest software on a vintage computer, you know?
Oh, totally.
Glitches are bound to happen.
Yeah, for sure.
And the book actually calls this accelerating novelty. You know, like we're bombarded with all this new tech, information overload, experiences our ancestors couldn't even like fathom.
Okay, so our brains are a little behind the times, but isn't that where human adaptability comes in? I mean, we're not exactly known for standing still, evolutionarily speaking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the authors, they really celebrate that resilience.
Okay.
They even dedicate the book to figures like you've got Douglas Heying, Harry Rubin,
Oh, wow.
who saw like the potential pitfalls of all this modernity way before, you know, most.
Way ahead of their time.
Yeah. But they also highlight the disharmony that all this rapid change creates.
Okay.
You know, it's like our ancient bodies kind of thrust into this totally new world.
Right, right.
And that's really at the root of so many issues we see today, I think.
So it's not just nostalgia for a simpler time, it's that like our biology is struggling to catch up.
Right.
Yeah.
You think about chronic diseases, you know, social unrest.
Mhm.
A lot of these things the book suggests are really symptoms of that mismatch. But here's the thing.
Okay.
Humans are incredible niche switchers.
Yes.
We don't just specialize like some animals.
Mhm.
We adapt. We thrive almost anywhere.
Like those intrepid folks that crossed the Bering Land Bridge, the Beringians.
Oh, absolutely.
Talk about a leap of faith. I mean, venturing into a totally unknown land.
And not only did they survive, they thrived in Beringia, like for generations.
Wow.
Even as the land itself was literally disappearing.
Oh, wow. The sea levels were rising.
You know, rising sea levels, exactly. Some headed back to Asia. Others became, you know, the first Americans.
Incredible.
And that's the Omega principle, you know, in action.
Okay.
Like their culture, their knowledge of hunting, adapting to the cold.
Yeah.
That influenced their very survival, even down to like which genes got passed down.
Wow.
It's a really powerful example of how us humans, we've always pushed those boundaries.
We
You know,
have.
that adaptability, it's woven into our very DNA.
So even though we're facing this, accelerating novelty, we have this like innate capacity to adjust.
Yeah.
That's kind of reassuring, right?
It is.
Like I'm stressed by my inbox, not a woolly mammoth, but still.
Exactly. And that's a big but. It requires self-awareness. This book
Yeah.
isn't just about like reminiscing about the past. It's about understanding ourselves better.
Right.
Our strengths, our weaknesses, even those kind of deep-seated instincts that drive our behavior, even when we don't realize it.
So how do we tap into that inner hunter-gatherer, that like ancient wisdom, to not just survive but actually thrive in the 21st century? That's what I'm really curious about.
And that's what's so fascinating about this book.
Yeah.
It's not just theory. It's actually full of like practical insights into how this evolutionary past is still influencing everything from our diets to our relationships, even how we're raising our kids.
It's all connected.
It's about bridging that gap between who we were and who we're becoming.
All right, so we've established our brains are kind of playing catch up with this modern world, right?
Right.
But let's get into like the nitty gritty
Yeah.
of how this whole evolutionary hangover like plays out in our actual lives. Because the book, it delves into some like pretty personal territory.
It does, yeah.
Like sex and gender roles, which,
Oh, yeah.
can be a bit of a minefield these days.
Absolutely. And the authors, they kind of dive right in with a story from their own lives.
Oh, really?
That, I think, perfectly illustrates this clash between like biology and culture.
Okay, yeah.
Remember the anecdote from Nicaragua?
Oh, yeah, where Heather gets like whacked with a basketball.
Yeah.
What a way to kick off a discussion about gender roles, right?
Right. And it's actually the reaction that's so telling.
Okay.
This group of young men, they like apologize profusely
Oh, wow.
to Brett for what happened to his wife.
Yeah,
You're right.
that is interesting.
It's subtle, but it really highlights how in some cultures, even today,
Yeah.
those traditional gender roles, they run deep.
They do.
And those roles, as the book explains, are really rooted in our evolutionary past.
Okay, so break that down for me. Like how so?
Well, think about it. For like millions of years, men and women, they face different evolutionary pressures.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Right. Men with their almost limitless sperm,
Right, go forth and spread thy seed.
Exactly. They were
Yeah.
wired for competition, striving to spread those genes far and wide. Women, on the other hand, with their, precious limited eggs,
Right.
they become the investors.
Okay.
Carefully choosing mates.
Yeah.
And then, nurturing their offspring.
So it's like those classic nature documentaries. Like the males are always like strutting their stuff, trying to,
Totally.
attract a mate, and the females are kind of like the discerning choosers, right? Looking for the best genetic material for their offspring.
Exactly. And those different reproductive strategies, right, played out over like millennia. It's shaped our biology, our hormones, even our behaviors, But here's the crucial point.
Okay.
Recognizing these differences doesn't mean we're stuck with some kind of like prehistoric script
Right.
for how men and women should behave.
Right. Biology's not destiny. We're not cavemen and cavewomen anymore. Thank goodness. We've evolved beyond that, right?
Exactly. And the authors really emphasize that.
Okay.
They're not like arguing for a return to like super traditional gender roles or anything like
Oh,
that.
right.
They're saying, hey, let's just be aware of these like deep-seated influences. But let's not pretend they dictate our every move in the 21st century.
Right.
We can acknowledge these differences without using them to justify inequality.
It's like that saying, know your roots, but don't be afraid to grow new branches.
I like that.
It's about understanding where we came from, but also having the freedom to create a future that's, more equitable for everyone.
Precisely. And speaking of freedom,
Ooh.
the authors, they dedicate a whole section to love.
Okay.
And not just like the butterflies and rainbows kind of love, but the like
Deep stuff.
the deep evolutionary purpose behind it.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Love and evolution. Tell me more.
So the book proposes this idea that love, in all its, messy glory,
Yeah.
is actually an adaptation, like a response to this unique challenge of raising human offspring.
Okay.
Think about it.
Yeah.
Human babies are incredibly vulnerable.
Oh, yeah.
Dependent for years,
Yeah.
requiring an immense amount of care and investment.
So love is like the biological glue that keeps parents together, long enough to raise those like helpless infants into functioning adults.
Exactly. It's about survival. Plain and simple.
Wow.
Love motivates us to care for others, even when it's hard, even when it means sacrificing our own needs for the sake of, our children, our families,
Yeah.
our communities even.
Wow, that really puts a whole new spin on those like late night diaper changes, doesn't it? He's
Yeah.
like, I'm not just exhausted, I'm participating in the grand evolutionary saga of humanity.
Exactly. And the authors actually trace this whole love as adaptation thing back to the very emergence of mammals.
Oh, wow.
So unlike reptiles who, lay their eggs and kind of peace out,
Right. Yeah.
mammals evolved this whole new way of caring for their young. Live birth, lactation, extended parental care.
Which requires a serious level of commitment, right? You can't exactly outsource breastfeeding.
Exactly. So along with these new parenting demands came a need for stronger emotional bonds.
Right.
Love evolved to keep those bonds tight, ensuring the survival of these, big-brained, helpless infants.
That's fascinating. So from those early like mammalian cuddle puddles to our modern day obsession with like romantic comedies. It's all connected to this like deep-seated drive to love and care for others.
Precisely. And that brings us to another crucial aspect of raising those big-brained babies, childhood itself.
Okay.
The book argues that humans evolved such a long childhood for a very specific reason.
Which is?
Our brains.
Okay.
They're incredibly complex and they take a long time to develop.
It's like those tech gadgets. The more sophisticated the technology, the longer it takes to boot up.
Exactly. And we're not like other animals, hardwired with instincts from day one. We're born with this amazing potential, but it takes time, exploration, and yes, even risk to really reach that potential.
And that's where things get really interesting, because the book argues that our modern obsession with safety and risk aversion might actually be backfiring.
Absolutely. The authors talk about how children are hardwired to take risks.
Yeah, they are, aren't they?
To explore their limits, to learn through trial and error. That's how they build resilience, how they develop the skills and judgment they need to navigate the world.
Which is kind of terrifying for us parents, right?
I know.
We spend so much energy trying to keep our kids safe.
Yeah.
Bubble wrap them from every possible danger.
Right.
And the authors are saying that by preventing kids from taking risks, we're actually doing them a disservice.
Yeah.
Wow.
Not allowing them to develop the skills they'll need to actually handle those inevitable challenges life throws their way.
So it's about finding that balance, right?
Yes.
Between protecting our kids and letting them explore, between shielding them from harm and allowing them to learn from their mistakes.
Exactly. And they share this amazing anecdote about a rule they had for their own children.
Oh, I remember this. Wasn't it something like, you're allowed to break a bone, but don't mess with your senses?
Yeah.
That's both terrifying and kind of brilliant.
It is. And it speaks to this idea of encouraging healthy risk taking.
Yeah.
Let kids climb trees, build forts, experiment, even skin their knees once in a while.
As long as they're wearing a helmet when they're careening downhill on the bike.
Of course, there are limits, obviously. But the point is we need to rethink our approach to risk.
Okay.
We need to let kids be kids, let them explore their boundaries, and yes, even to fail sometimes.
Yeah.
Because that's how they learn and grow.
So how does this translate to education? Because let's face it, sitting in a classroom memorizing facts doesn't exactly scream hunter-gatherer ingenuity.
You're hitting on a major point of the book.
Okay.
The authors argue that formal schooling, well-intentioned, often misses the mark.
Meaning it's not really how our brains are wired to learn.
Exactly. Think about it. For most of human history, we learned through observation, through hands-on experience, storytelling, apprenticeship. Right. We were immersed in the real world, figuring things out as we went. Formal schooling, it's a relatively recent invention.
So our brains are basically wired for a different kind of learning.
Yeah.
One that's more experiential, more hands-on, more connected to the real world.
Exactly. And the authors argue that this mismatch between how we've evolved to learn and how we're being taught is leading to a whole host of problems.
Such as?
From, just basic lack of engagement to a stifling of creativity and critical thinking.
Oh, wow. Yeah, those are important.
Yeah.
So what's the solution? Do we ditch schools altogether and send our kids off into the woods to learn survival skills?
That's one approach, but not necessarily practical for everyone.
True.
The book emphasizes that we need to rethink our approach to education, basically.
Okay.
To make it more aligned with how our brains are actually wired to learn.
So more hands-on learning, more real-world applications, more opportunities for exploration and discovery.
Exactly. And they offer some really intriguing examples of educators who are already doing this.
Oh, cool.
Who are throwing out that traditional playbook and creating learning environments that are more engaging, more relevant, and ultimately more effective.
That's really inspiring. It gives me hope that we can actually bridge this gap, between how we've evolved to learn and how we're currently being taught.
Right.
But speaking of bridging gaps, I feel like we haven't even touched on the book's most ambitious idea yet, the fourth frontier. What exactly does that even mean?
This is where the book takes a really truly macro view.
Okay.
Looking at the big picture of humanity and our place in the world. The authors argue that we've exhausted the traditional frontiers.
Okay.
We've explored the globe. We've, harnessed technology.
Right.
We've tapped into the Earth's resources.
And we're kind of facing the consequences of that, right?
Yes.
Climate change, social unrest, resource depletion. It's not a pretty picture.
It's not always pretty, no. The fourth frontier, as they envision it, isn't about conquering some new external territory.
Okay.
It's about a shift in consciousness.
Okay.
A recognition that we can't keep chasing infinite growth on a finite planet.
Okay, so it's less about what's next and more about how do we live sustainably with what we've got. That's a pretty radical idea.
It is. But the book argues that this shift in thinking isn't just idealistic.
Okay.
It's essential for our survival as a species.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that we're part of this larger ecosystem.
Right.
That our actions have consequences.
Yes.
And that our long-term well-being is dependent on the health of the planet.
So it's not just about swapping out our light bulbs and, driving electric cars. It's about a fundamental rethinking of our relationship with the natural world.
Precisely. And it goes even deeper than that.
Okay.
The fourth frontier is also about challenging the dominant narratives of our time.
Okay.
Like the myth of endless growth, the pursuit of individual gain at all costs.
Right.
The idea that more is always better.
Hitting the reset button on our values.
Yes.
Right? Shifting from a mindset of scarcity and competition to one of abundance and cooperation.
Exactly. And that shift in mindset is something that's accessible to all of us, regardless of our circumstances.
Okay. So how do we actually do that?
Well, it's about making conscious choices in our daily lives that actually reflect these values.
Give me an example. What kind of choices?
Well, consuming less, connecting more, prioritizing experiences over possessions.
Okay.
And really find that joy and simplicity.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because in a way, this fourth frontier sounds a lot like the values that our hunter-gatherer ancestors lived by,
Yeah.
Like a deep connection to nature, a strong sense of community, a focus on present moment experience.
That's a really insightful observation. Yeah. And it speaks to this idea that the wisdom we need to navigate the challenges of the 21st century might actually be encoded within us.
Oh, wow.
And those ancient instincts and values that we've inherited from our ancestors.
So it's not just about looking ahead to some distant future. It's also about looking back to our past.
Yes.
To those timeless principles that have always sustained human life on Earth.
Exactly. And that's what makes this book so compelling, I think.
Yeah.
It's not just a critique of the modern world. It's also a roadmap for creating a better future.
Okay.
One that's more aligned with who we are as a species and with the needs of the planet.
Well said, well said. But before we get too caught up in the grandeur of this whole fourth frontier idea, let's bring it back down to earth for a moment.
Yeah.
The book also offers some very practical advice.
It does.
For living a healthier, happier life, even amidst all the chaos of the 21st century.
Absolutely. And a lot of it comes down to realigning our lives with the rhythms and the needs that our hunter-gatherer ancestors, they just understood instinctively.
Like sleep, for instance.
Yeah, great example.
I mean, we all know we need it, but I, for one, am guilty of sacrificing sleep in the name of productivity, which ironically it probably makes me less productive in the long run.
It's that classic sucker's folly the book talks about.
Oh, right, yeah.
That short-term gain for long-term pain.
Yeah.
And sleep is a perfect example of how out of touch we become with our natural rhythms.
So tell me, from like an evolutionary perspective, why is sleep so important, and why does it feel like such a struggle these days?
Well, you know how some animals are like built for the day,
right?
Others are like creatures of the night.
Yeah.
Well, imagine trying to have eyes that are optimized for both.
Oh.
You'd end up with like mediocre vision all the time.
Right.
And the author suggests that's kind of what sleep is all about.
Okay.
Like it's a necessary trade-off. We shut down for a while to allow for like peak performance when it matters.
So we traded 204/7 of vision for a power nap and a dream upgrade.
Exactly.
Not a bad deal evolutionarily speaking, but then why are so many of us struggling to get a good night's sleep these days?
And that's where we come back to accelerating novelty again.
Oh, okay.
Artificial light, constant stimulation, work deadlines creeping into our nighttime hours.
Right.
Our ancestors, they never faced this kind of sensory overload.
It's true.
Our bodies are basically stuck with a sleep cycle that was designed for a world lit by firelight, not LED screens.
Makes you want to like curl up in a dark cave and hibernate for a few months, doesn't it?
Right.
But seriously, if we're ignoring those like natural sleep rhythms, what's the impact?
Well, the book connects the dots to a whole host of like modern ailments.
Okay.
From the obvious ones like fatigue, brain fog, to more serious issues like metabolic disorders,
Yeah.
increased risk of chronic diseases. It's like running a delicate machine without ever giving it proper downtime.
Right.
Eventually, something's going to give.
Okay, so that's the stick. What about the carrot? What are we missing out on when we skimp on sleep?
Well, remember those dreams we talked about?
Yeah.
They're not just like random firings in the night.
Right.
The book suggests dreams are like our brain's overnight processing center.
Okay.
Consolidating memories, regulating emotion, even sparking like creative insights.
Hold on, you're telling me my best ideas might come to me in my sleep?
Maybe.
That's a good argument for like ditching the late night work emails if I've ever heard one.
Exactly.
Okay. All right.
And beyond just the like cognitive benefits of good sleep, it's crucial for physical repair, hormone regulation.
It's true.
It's like a nightly tune-up for your entire system.
I like that. So we've covered sleep, which honestly impacts like every aspect of our lives.
It does.
But there's another biggie that the book tackles: food.
Yes.
And not in like a trendy diet fad way, but through this like evolutionary lens. What's the main takeaway there?
The authors make a really compelling argument that a lot of our modern health woes, they really stem from what we're putting into our bodies.
Okay.
Our digestive systems, evolved over millions of years.
Right.
They're suddenly being bombarded with these food-like substances that our ancestors couldn't have even imagined.
Processed foods, refined sugars, things that are like engineered for shelf life over nutritional value.
Exactly.
It's no wonder our bodies are freaking out, right?
Precisely. It's like putting the wrong fuel in a high-performance engine.
Oh, yeah.
You might get away with it for a while,
right.
but eventually you're going to have problems. And the authors use this term mismatch diseases.
Mismatch diseases.
Yeah, and it refers to illnesses that are directly linked to this disconnect between our modern diets and our evolutionary past.
So what's the solution? Are we all doomed to like a life of foraging for berries and like chasing down wild game?
Thankfully, no.
Okay.
The book isn't advocating for a return to like a strict hunter-gatherer lifestyle.
Okay.
But rather a more mindful approach to our food choices.
Okay, so like what does that look like?
Well, it's about understanding the principles behind our ancestral diets.
Okay.
Prioritizing whole foods, healthy fats, seasonal produce,
right.
and then applying those principles to the modern world.
So less about following like a rigid diet plan,
right.
and more about developing like an awareness of what actually nourishes us both physically and mentally.
Exactly. It's about tuning into those internal cues.
Okay.
Listening to what your body actually needs.
Right.
And making choices that support your long-term health and well-being.
It sounds like a recipe for not just a healthier body, but also like a saner relationship with food in general.
I think so.
And that's something I think we could all use a little more of these days.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the book's most, I'd say, expansive and some might even say radical idea.
Okay.
This idea of the fourth frontier.
Right.
We touched on it earlier.
Yeah, we did.
But I think it's worth like really revisiting.
Yeah, for sure. So for those who like missed it, remind us, what is this whole fourth frontier concept?
Okay, so the authors propose that humanity, throughout history, we've chased after these three main frontiers.
Okay.
Geographical, technological, and resource-based.
Okay.
So we've explored new lands,
right.
developed new tools, tapped into new sources of energy.
Right, and with each frontier conquered, we've also encountered like limitations, right? Like sometimes those limitations have come back to bite us. Like exploiting natural resources to the point of like depletion, for example, not our proudest moment.
The fourth frontier, as they envision it, it isn't about conquering some new external territory.
Okay.
It's about a shift in consciousness.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that we can't keep chasing infinite growth on a finite planet.
So it's less about like what's next and more about how do we live sustainably with what we've got.
Yes.
That's a pretty radical idea in a world that's like obsessed with progress and expansion.
It is radical, but the book argues that this shift in thinking, it's not just idealistic.
Yeah.
It's essential for our survival as a species.
Wow.
It's about recognizing that we're part of a larger ecosystem.
Yes.
That our actions have consequences.
Right.
And that our long-term well-being, it depends on the health of this planet.
So it's not just about like swapping out our light bulbs and driving electric cars. It's about like a fundamental rethinking of our relationship with the natural world.
Precisely. And it goes even deeper than that.
Okay.
The fourth frontier is also about challenging like the dominant narratives of our time.
Okay, like what? Give me an example.
The myth of endless growth, the pursuit of like individual gain at all costs.
Right.
The idea that more is always better.
Right. It's like hitting the reset button on our values.
Yes.
Shifting from a mindset of scarcity and competition to one of like abundance and cooperation.
Exactly. And that shift in mindset is something that's accessible to all of us.
Okay, good.
Regardless of our circumstances.
So how do we do it? How do we make that shift?
Well, it's about making conscious choices in our daily lives that actually reflect these values.
Like what? Give me an example.
Consuming less, connecting more, prioritizing experiences over possessions.
Right.
Finding that joy and simplicity.
It's interesting because in a way, this fourth frontier, it sounds a lot like the values that, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, they just lived by.
It's true.
Like a deep connection to nature, a strong sense of community, a focus on present moment experience.
That's a really like insightful observation.
Yeah.
And it speaks to this idea that the wisdom we need to navigate the challenges of the 21st century.
Yeah.
It might already be encoded within us.
Oh, wow.
In those like ancient instincts and values that we've inherited from our ancestors.
So it's not just about looking ahead to some like distant future. It's also about looking back to our past, to those like timeless principles that have always sustained human life here on Earth.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this book so compelling.
Yeah.
It's not just a critique of the modern world. It's also a roadmap for creating a better future.
I like that.
One that's more aligned with, who we are as a species and with the needs of the planet.
Beautifully said. Well, On that note of like cautious optimism,
Yeah.
I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into a hunter-gatherer's guide to the 21st century.
Yes, we have.
It's been a wild ride. From the African savannah to the modern metropolis.
It has.
From the evolution of sleep to the future of humanity.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did.
Yeah.
I hope our listeners are walking away from this conversation with a renewed sense of wonder about our place in the world.
I hope so too.
And, maybe with a few practical tools for like navigating these unique challenges of the 21st century.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because ultimately that's what this book is all about, right?
It is.
Empowering us to live like healthier, happier, more meaningful lives, even in a world that often feels like it's moving at warp speed.
It's a good reminder that we're not just like passive passengers on this evolutionary journey.
Right.
We're active participants, and we're shaping the future with every choice that we make.
So to our listeners out there, we leave you with this. Embrace your inner hunter-gatherer.
Yes.
Listen to the wisdom of your body.
Your body has the answers.
It does. And join us in exploring like this uncharted territory.
It's exciting.
It is exciting. Of the fourth frontier.
The fourth frontier, that's where it's at.
That's where it's at.
Yeah.
The adventure is just beginning.